Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the dying days of the Roman Republic, that is, before the emperors came along. So just a real quick history lesson. At around 600 BC, when Rome was a city or a town really at the time, its rulers were kings. They got booted out, and the Romans decided on a limited form of democracy, with the major landowners and other heavy hitters making up a council that they called the Senate. So Rome, in fact, became a republic. Now, at around 100 BC, there was a lot of major tribal movements around Europe, and the Cimbri or Cimbri, as they're sometimes called, and Teutons and other Vandals and so on, other tribes from around Europe started coming into northern Italy, and they were quite large in number and managed to defeat some Roman armies. So during times of great stress, the Romans had two sort of head senators, what they call consuls, and one of those would be designated dictatorial powers during times of great stress. Now, invasion by a hostile force qualified as one of those triggers for creating a dictator. So the consul at the time was a guy called Gaius Marius, who was a general, and he was sent north with an army to try and stop these Cimbrian, Teuton, Vandals, and all that. That were quite numerous. I mean, their army numbered some 400,000 or so, it was alleged. Marius went up with an army of give or take 100,000, and they sort of moved around and tried to outmaneuver each other, and they eventually met in battle at a place in southeastern France, a place called Acquisexti. This was a big victory for the Romans and for Marius, and a grateful nation was prepared to vote him various honours. Now, this was the beginning of the end. This is where the politician and the general and the dictator all sort of rolled into one. And this was the sort of an unusual confluence of events, and it began a chain of events where Rome fell into civil war, where various heavies, typically generals with loyal armies, would effectively, take over, or try and take over at least. Now, given there are a number of warring factions, it was never clear cut, but the civil war raged on. There was Marius, and then Sulla. One of Sulla's proteges was Pompey the Great, as he became known later on, and then there were other players in the game, such as Julius Caesar, who'd conquered Gaul and who'd acquired vast riches in the process. Now, Julius Caesar ended the civil war and had himself declared effectively dictator for 10 years. Now, this the Senate was prepared to accept. I mean, perhaps grudgingly in some ways, but they're prepared to accept because it brought an end to the civil war, and it could bring peace and stability back to Rome. And that's what everybody wanted. Bear in mind, at this time, Rome's been in a state of civil war on and off, but pretty much permanent for something like 40 plus years. So Julius Caesar was tolerated. Then Caesar sort of made a bit of a mistake and said he wanted to be dictator for life, and started acting in what many saw as a tyrannical manner, and bypassing the Senate and really just treating the Senate as some sort of rubber stamp. Now, we need to look at while the Roman sort of republic is falling to pieces, which it clearly was at this stage. There are various things that are going on, and we can see parallels, I believe, with today. If anyone has opinions that aren't liked, if it's quite at all possible, In those days, they were either bribed or killed, but preferably killed. So even prominent senators and so on were just murdered, and that would shut them up. So it's viewed to stop opinions you didn't like, you go around and just kill people. Now we see, I think, similar today, where if people come up with opinions or have opinions that aren't liked, particularly if they've got a decent following, they're deplatformed, and if they complain about elections that they find, where the results are just incredible and remarkable, then they're put in prison, January 6th and these sorts of things. So we're looking, I think, today at a very similar setup to what was happening in Rome. Now, today we don't kill people; they just deplatform. They're bankrupted and maybe put in prison, and sort of the tiny little trembling girl comes along with a torn dress, and he raped me. Any setup, the false flag operations, FBI agents and CIA goons infiltrating any sort of group or political party organization to create false flag situations, such again as we saw in January 6th and in other situations where the various forces are actively working to create incidents that discredit anyone who holds alternative or opposing views. And this was so in Rome. They were doing exactly the same thing. Rioters would go and do riot, burn something down, kill a few people while they were dressed in certain clothing, and so we're supporters of this guy or that guy, which would then discredit that. So then that guy could be arrested or again murdered, and so on. Various, the city became ungovernable. There were special street gangs that were owned by various power groups that were sent to make the city unworkable, to make sure commerce ground to a halt, to burn things down, create all sorts of acts of mass disruption and murder and mayhem and looting and beatings and so on. And these groups, every political center of power had their own groups that were trying to spread this. Now, the difference with Black Lives Matter and Antifa today, I see no difference at all. I see that is exactly the same. What was going on in ancient Rome in 40 odd BC or even earlier is happening today across the West, in particularly the United States, Britain, and we see it in Australia as well. So I see the parallels there as just remarkable. Deliberate attempts to destabilize the city or the state and make it ungovernable. Similarly, there was appointing judges and magistrates and various political officials, local treasury officials, quaestors as they called them, to engage in all sorts of corruption and grafting. We see this today, the way Antifa will have a riot somewhere, and then they'll be able to sue the Democrat city and get a few $100,000 each. And these are things that effectively can financially underwrite Antifa and its continued disruptive operations in our societies. And the same goes in ancient Rome. The quaestors would secretly fund these groups, buying them weapons or feeding them or housing them or bringing them in from the regions to act as goons. Special Jewish assassins were brought in to murder quietly and murder people in the back streets and the back alleys and of Rome and so on. So these things are very similar to what we see today. I mean, they killed people with the wrong opinions back then, but I don't know how far away that is now in the West. I mean, are we really that far away from it? If they're prepared to arbitrarily arrest, if they're prepared to manufacture evidence, if they're prepared to engage in conspiracy to conceal evidence, I mean, how far away is the state sanctioning the murder of people they don't like? I mean, it can't be that far away from where we are now. Given that each day the state, the US Department of Justice gives itself an extra bit of license to go out and act, in my opinion, unconstitutionally and illegally. Now, if we look then at the various contestants, if you will, or those seeking ultimate power in those dying days of the Roman Republic. Bear in mind, in 27 BC, Octavian Caesar, who became known as Augustus, became the first emperor of what was known as the Principate. That is, after the Republic, the emperors came along, and the emperor stayed until the whole Roman Empire went to shit. But so if we look at the major players, and these were the people such as Octavian, Mark Antony, Lepidus and Pompey, Brutus and Cassius, and some other lesser minor players were involved in this, all seeking power and glory and riches to varying degrees. Now, if we look at how their attitude was that if I can't have it, I'm going to make sure there's nothing left for you. If I can't win, I'm going to make sure there's just this desolate landscape, not a tree left standing, not a building left standing, not a nickel or a dime to be had, not a live farm animal to be seen, that sort of thing. Now, this is not just a case of denying the enemy the means to wage war. It's more than that. It's this view that if I can't have the power, I'll make sure that whatever is left is going to be useless to you. And that sort of bloody mindedness, I used to notice that in I remember this high school I briefly went to, which was filled with very, very few. What can I say? It was racially diverse, and these racially diverse people had this odd, particularly from the Middle East, they had this odd view that they would demand. Say you're eating, I don't know, an ice cream on a hot day that you bought at the school canteen, they would demand a bite out of your ice cream. And if you wouldn't do it, they would try and knock the ice cream out of your hand and stamp on it. And this was very much this is just how they were. Or it could be a sweet cake or some chocolate or anything. They would try and do that. And I hadn't seen that before. As a sort of a prevalent, attitude that they all seem to have. I hadn't seen it, so it struck me as rather odd. But anyway, this was very much the attitude with the Romans. Now I see this today. The globalists are very sure that if we can't have power, we'll make sure the whole system is ungovernable and unworkable and useless to you. Look at the way they attempted to undermine Trump. Now, whatever Trump had won fairly, the people had decided, and that was, hey, that's the decision. So they should have left Trump to get on with it. If Trump was going to fail, then the people could decide to kick him out. That's why we have elections. But instead, no, they were determined to make the entire system useless and unworkable to him, so he could achieve nothing and do nothing. Now, this is very much the globalist shtick, and so you can see that in the behaviour of the various participants in the Roman Republic struggle, where they were determined they didn't care if Rome was levelled, if there was nothing left, not a building left standing, as long as the other guy didn't derive advantage or benefit or anything from it. And so that they turned the Senate into just some sort of useless little thing. At least arbitrarily murdered senators who they didn't like. Now, the last thing I'll talk about here is transfers of wealth. One of the things that the various people in the power political game did was they looked at the richest citizens, typically the senators and the rich merchants, those sort of guys, and manufactured fake crimes that they'd committed along some moral ideological thing, and then had them murdered, and then confiscated their wealth, which in some instances was quite a substantial wealth. And this wealth was then used to fund the civil war, bribe other officials, pay off soldiers, this sort of thing. Now, these transfers of wealth went on for the sole purpose of furthering the struggle over the Republic. Now, in my view, I see parallels today. I think the globalists are playing a long game. I think they decided in the 1970s to launch the globalist project. But I think they were caught unawares of the collapse of the Soviet Union and also China switching to a more capitalist type model. I think both of these things caught them a little bit by surprise. So they switched tempo and upped the ante quite considerable, which is why it became far more noticeable in the early from the early 1990s onwards. We see this huge uptick in talking about mass migration and various devices to undermine Western society. We're beset with all sorts of moral problems. We've got this epidemic of violence by men against women. We've got this epidemic of violence against children. We've got this epidemic of racism, epidemic of this, that, and the all these epidemic of fucking global warming. So they invent all these moral panic epidemic type situations, but they're just devices to transfer wealth. Now, if you look at all these so-called moral panic type epidemics, the first epidemic was to transfer through the divorce courts, was to transfer wealth from men to women, and then transfer jobs held by men to women. That was sort of stage one, which is as much to lower wages, but it wasn't for women. It's to undermine the power of men. This was seen as critical in the overall architecture of the globalist project. The next thing was to break up the family, which again was sort of part of that same subset. Then the mass migration, again wages reducing and so on, but also to undermine the very things that would impede the globalist project, which were a fully functioning democracy. The globalists, very hard to penetrate and take control of a fully functioning democracy. You have to corrupt it in the same ways they did in ancient Rome. Kill off the people that you can't bribe, turn the Senate into some sort of laughing stock, turn senators into nothing more than ceremonial speech readers and so on. The Emperor Caligula even made his horse a senator, just to remind the senators that you're nothing. You're not even the shit on my shoes. I can do anything I want, and I can even make my horse a senator. So these sort of attitudes and behaviours were already evident, before the Principate, before the emperors came along. Augustus treated the Senate in a relative basis probably more respect than had been, but they were still, the senators still aware that these guys with big armies behind them and so on, they can just arbitrarily murder whoever they want. One of the most famous orators and writers of all time in certainly the ancient world was Marcus Cicero, and he was just ordered to be murdered. I mean, they murdered him in his fucking villa, for Christ's sake, just because they didn't like what he's saying and didn't like his views, didn't think they could control him. He believed in an independent state ruled by the Senate, and so we'll kill you. And so these sorts of things. In my view, these transfers of wealth, the next transfer of wealth was transferring wealth from white people to black and brown people, transferring wealth from white people offshore to, say, China and things like that, to try and, and it's stealing money, jobs and wealth from the working people of the West, the people at the apex. They didn't suffer at all. In fact, if anything, they got richer out of it. They just took your job and my job and our wealth away. The next step was the transfer of wealth, which we're seeing right now, the transfer of wealth through this the global warming project. All of it reducing our standards of living, which, if you look since, say, the 1970s to today, the cost of the standard of living has decreased. It's the purchasing power of the paycheck is 2/3 less than what it was in the 1970s. So that just illustrates, I think, the degree to which all these, the impact of all these transfers of wealth away from the white people and the white working class, white men in particular, and the effect it's had on the purchasing power. And yet, in spite of all this, Western women, white women, cheer it all on. They can't have enough of it. I don't think there's ever been a time in the history of the human race where a large section of a society has actually, violently and aggressively sought the destruction of their own of their own society. It's insane. You can scarcely believe it when you talk about it. But so I see these parallels with the collapse of the Roman Republic. Now, when the Roman Republic sort of fell apart, there were too many players trying to lunge for power. In the end, Octavian won. Augustus won, primarily because of he had a very capable general on his side, Marcus Agrippa. Without Marcus Agrippa, he would not have prevailed. Agrippa was not only a competent general on land, but also quite a competent naval commander, quite imaginative, and was prepared to develop new weapons to suit circumstances, things like that. So he was one of Rome's, like if you look at all the competent generals in Roman history, he'd have to rank amongst that top league. Such was his ability to deliver victories, without which Augustus would never have sat on the throne of the Roman Empire. So is that where we're heading in the West? If the globalists fail, then and it's going to be a close run thing if they do. I hope they do. But if the globalists fail, then what embittered, angry, almost bankrupted rump of a Western society will remain? What we do, will we go back to the rule of law, due legal process, free and fair elections, and will we go back to that? Will that be rigorously enforced, or will we go with something else? Will we go with anyone who provided they'll stop the globalists, and what will be the result of that? So these are some of the as many questions as more questions than there are answers. But that's my sort of thoughts on the parallels with the ancient Roman Republic. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.